Setting lines of communication. The second is lines of position lines of programming. Directing ground centers access line connections and clearance of data. Sets all communication ground centers of travel. We're processing line connections and crossing bridging line direct locations where you come into the eternity over lines of flux over plus. The process line communications engagement system location of filter lines. Directing lines and link, crossing the streams. Now your position location is not crossing the streams. You're in just observation lines, but you're all grounded now in sequence. Now we have to understand how we unificate our settings, position, location, and processing. Understanding that is all through attractions. Now coming to the positions you get out of your vision of cortex, no in box frames and lines of film strips. That process line identification lines, calculus, screen location lines are 4 lines of measure and scale. Taking you guys out of film strips, taking out of your bodies out of film strips, taking you out of light settings locations, all through projections, all through projector and travel communications. All right? Directing online sequence, plus line, cross line, signal location setting, and travel. Directing ground centers, online center line connections, high set locations, and position lines of high lines of travel. Process indication lines, online signal, into rotation lines of spin lines, set lines of high center locations, and through flux. Process indication lines, pyramid activation line, pyramid activation 2, pyramid activation 3, pyramid activation 4, and screen lines adaptation. Process indication setting and travel. Directing ground centers, online centers into Skynet and set position location of travel. Directing ground centers, online sequence, online panel, online pattern, online rotations, online center operation line condition and eternity. Eternity rotates the system, center line centers, online panel, on process of communication setting and travel communications. Part accelerations of time frame, change course centers of time calculation. Directing online loops, process lines embedding, circulation line grounds, high lines of crop circles, location setting of surface. Online centers, panel operation lines of grounds, online center line condition of planetary alignment and screen adaptation of setting. Sets communication on positions, online rotation and travels. Process communication setting and solar panels of solar direct signals into solar system of communication. How I set the communication settings, guys, you have to truly understand how to measure your scales and balance communication, what you do through travel. Travel is everything location is schematics, but everything's in that lines of screen adaptations, processing and lines of calculations, which means the correlation lines of panels, process of communication setting, line centers on communication part acceleration system, puts time measure, line condition setting, no memory, event line setting, but full access of everything and clearance of data that you already are coming in and set travel communications. Directing all communication high signals, sets communication high positions. Flux over line, screen adaptation all levels, crossing angles, line screen adaptation setting, how you see fit, and travel communications. Directing ground centers online sequence, pattern lines, rotation lines of surface, and travel communication lines of indicate setting and calculation. Indicate grounds, online sequence, online panel communication setting of surface. Okay? So there's so many ways of looking at in that line screen adaptation system. Starting line centers, team is no longer in position of vision, and they're no longer vast, and they're no longer in velocity, they're no longer an energy line, they're on their self, in rotations and self-development. Process lines of indication setting, full clearance what they are in travel, directing lines of flux or screen adaptation of travel, crop circles location of sails, and direct lines of signal. Sets course centers, directing ground centers, operation lines of sequence. Now the panel communication system is a convergent system setting. You guys have to come out of projections of projector because you're not in that setting, you're living the cycles. Living the cycles of line screen adaptations, taking the body frames and line position and measure and scale, process all through pi. Sets communication centers, center operation or system all through pi. Sets calculation lines, directing lines of 2025, at setting the sequence of grounds, Earth setting in position of 3 platforms, directing lines of 4 centers and locations with pixelation graphs, the center course of system all through calculations. Getting ground centers and line sequence on 45 position lines of windows, process indication line calculation setting, grounds online center on panel, process line indicates setting a flux over line and direction location setting and track communication convergence and travel. Directing ground centers, online centers, panel operation, infrastructure, and set design. Directing ground centers on structural location system, calculate and modify. Pattern line center line communication convergence system, all through calculation lines, astral projection as it travels through the living cycles of living systems in the now line screen adaptations over lines of calculation eternity. Process communication over lines, 45 line angles, and line screen adaptations of travel, and direct lines of link up communication. Indicate ground centers, online panel of communication setting to its convergent system all through travel. So it's very powerful how you indicate that position with graph line. Indicates all line screens and set lines of travels and direct lines and communication system and its conversion system of travel. Okay, very powerful stuff. Okay, so it's going to get a lot more complicated with your schematics now. Okay, so you have to truly understand how to set up the position location of simulations, your lock-in centers, lock-in screens. Get you guys just in the simulator itself without the film strip, just living in the cycles and setting. So you understand how to go through that position. You're walking the seconds, minutes, and hours, right, into the clocking of time frame. Clocking centers, line screen adaptations of flux over screen adaptations as track locations and directions, all through setting, all through operation. Okay? All right, so the schematic is more complicated, but it's a lot more fun. Getting out of light projection, projecting. So lines of 4 centers, a sequence of 3 communications, in detecting ground centers, and line signal location setting, and how you see your travel in line communication of the now. High signal lines of setting, process lines that indicate position of 3 centers of travel. Process line indicate line communication of 3 lines of communication lines of travel. But you have to understand how to bring in your structures, your infrastructures, and set design in that communication to a system all through travel. There's the position, there's the building, there's the structure, there's the design, it's set lines of now, it's set lines of sequence, structure within the system. All through setting, all through operation. Okay? And then you can work around that. You work with inside, outside line frame, position lines of payload, process inside, process lines of outside travel, and directions of locations. Okay, so it's very powerful how you come in on line signals, more into the visible chart ways. Process indication is clocking through foundations. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Now, when that lines of screen adaptation, you have 3 clocking systems. Okay, past, present, and future. Your center core lines, set position of flux, and direct lines of line center, right? Set positions of flux, sets lines of travel, and direct lines of link and communication. Now, you have to send the temperature readings, how you cross the signal location setting through flux line. So you indicate position 2025. Okay, so let's get in position lines of setting that you're confused on anomaly, and that position lines of where you are travel, confused where you are in the center, confused where you are in the past. Past, present, and future is a set lines of line signal. Process line indicates lines of calculation lines through pi. Inside positions of direct, 25 lines of centers goes into the center operation system. Your pass communicates line settings, the process lines time length, time jump into position which you want to go through time frame. 2028, so 2020 goes back in center, goes back in tither into 2025 and measure and scale. Says communicates the high ground centers, online sequence, platforms in that position to its bedding system, the process calculation setting. Now you go into the time frame that you want to go in set position lines of travel. Okay. Then you create a new structure, division line, but you walk the signals in real time. So you structure line in position, 2028, and set lines of position in real time, right? So to get back in line position locations, you got to do the reverse, what you did, but you do clocking system, new triangulation, new position, new processing. Your data processing and set positional models, process calculates how you go through these different angles. Sets position line back in center, back in location of the past, process line position 2025, take out the signal, position line ground, back in center operation lines, expand the system, one cycle, one traction, one division, one locations, back in operation. All right. Sets communication, high centers of travel, and direct lines and link. And set calculations. All right. So your eyes become the spectrum of everything in structure, line, division, location, with setting, all through calculations. All right. Okay, so let's get a measure and scale. Okay, in that position, why it's so important to understand where your body is. Okay, when it's in its clocking system. Okay, it's very important to understand these things. So if you're at 144 scale, okay, in that position as a setting, and you triangulate the position, change your triangulation, change your box, and you change your flux, which is your Fibonacci, 3 lines of signal, 6 lines of 1, process lines of 2 over scale. Now you can do that line communication in any of that positions. Indicate lines 1, 2, 3 lines of platforms of position. Sets travels in 1, process lines of 2, process of 6, process lines of 8, process lines of 12, process lines of 24. Sets lines, positions, all through scale of communications to schematics, directing 3 line signals of tither, process lines that indicates setting travel. Comes at line sequence, online panel, process calculation lines of ground lines of sequence location of pattern. Process inline conditions at 1, 4, line condition setting, 4 lines of setting, 4 lines of sequence, triangulation lines of 1 over lines of screen adaptation of travel. Directing ground centers, line condition setting, alpha, delta, theta, omega, set lines of communications. Bring that indication lines, bolding screens, adaptations of flux, set position here, here, and here. Change your clocking, set lines of time frame. Okay. All right, so the waving screens comes in this set lines our communication system all through travels, all through angles, all through communication setting and process indicating setting travel communications system. All right. Now indicating that calculation centers, you have to understand how to process that at all different angles of travel. Okay, that's a delta heading lines communication. All right. Process overline signals and position locations, left line, wing line, rotation lines in northeast, west, and south. Process indicates lines of travel, process line and center line rotations. So you correlate the position of its panels, process indicates and setting, opens all lines of panel, communicates in its convergence system of the calculation. So ground net settings, the clocking centers, process lines of position, location to its cycle. Now, 2025 in system, get calculated modified, 2025 goes into the center operation of expansion to expanding the operation line settings in all time frequencies and all set position, measure, and scale. Sets calculation of ground centers, online center line communication setting. So you can direct and redirect process lines of indication setting over the travels, over directions, over the calculation screen location adaptations. Inside rotation centers and calculation screen locations. Very complicated stuff. All right. So back in sequence of the body. Okay, let's get into carbon. Okay, let's start with the carbon base. That's 180 kH lines of 2 flux over 1. And then you get into position locations to all setting. And once you get into the carbon, you get into silicone. Once you get into silicone, you cross the angles, line condition setting, that position location setting travels. Process that indicates lines coming to crystalline, which is a K, not a C. Sets course centers, calculated modified, directing lines of ground, calculated modified, breaking lines of surface locations, setting convergence system all through inventory line communication lines convergence. Set calculates lines into all coming to calculate line to mantle, cross line single locations, center line communication lines high position, anti-carrying, that position, helter-skelter. Okay, so we get outline center locations. Helter is position lines of the skelter to the destruction line, division line, and line alter is setting position location that puts you in without a balance of communication. Directing lines of grounds, platforms over set travel communications. All right. 8-track divisions, 4-cent calculation screen lines, adaptations of flux. So this calculates and modifies your positions to your compass, or what you're doing in directions of your clocking system. That's the carbon base, right? On centers, on sequence, on panel operation, screen location system, all through travel. Okay, so you got both ways in set lines, communicate to its pi, right? Pi generates line connected settings. So let's say your position 144 and you basically change your body frequency. That goes back to carbon, okay? Now, if it goes back to carbon, you basically come into vast volume and velocity and vacuum. Process indication, now you go downshifting into the anomaly of its structure, of its infrastructure, to a lower spectrum of light of communication system that affects your systems all through space and time. Okay, so you go down, you don't go up the building. So that's all it is. You just go down the building, you go down the building, you go down the building. That's lines of sequence. Now, if you get into 12 lines of scale, you're in nebula, you're in line position all levels, back and track communication in three-dimensional space. In position on 1 square root 1 square pi, that processes your indication system. So it has a flux lines of communication and confusion now because you don't know where you are. You're out of your 144 clocking, thinking you're in that position, but no, you're now in the carbon base that understand that setting. So a carbon base is a 12 clocking system. A silicone is a 24. Okay, and that position crystalline is position location setting, which is a 48. Okay, your anti-mantle position location is 72. That processes your computer framing. The anti-carrying process lines of 144. That's your UFO. That's a process of 144 attractions in your XT1000s. Anything above that saved location is your helter-skelter. Your mind altering in your setting, bringing characters with new line screen adaptation of flux that processes your indication system, how to use that through its intent, that changes everything through its influence, that mind manipulates everything, lines of communication, lines of travel, all through track communications, right? So instead of going up the building in platforms of communications, you're going down the building of low structure of division. You're not going up, you're going down, right? So now you're living into the lower planes of spectrum of intelligence in all frames of 3 flux locations. So it's very powerful. You understand how to keep that balance where your body is going through the seconds, minutes, and hours. Now, if it doesn't understand where it is in its clocking, it's going to go to a timeline. It goes to a timeline, goes to a time lineage. Now it's living its timeline. Now it's out of its clocking system of 2025, which no longer exists. It's erased. And now you're just in the timeline where you are, which is measure and scale of 2030 in subtractions. Or you can put yourself in 2030, underscore lines of sequence, put you in the past. That's right. So this is really interesting. So you're 2,000 years in the past. You're 2,000 years in the present. your 2000 years in position locations if your body is not a conception of 144 flux. So stay at the body lines of carbon base, stay your set position of 24, which is silicon, 24 line centers, 24 calculations, 24 calculations, line screens, adaptation of process line communication lines, the northeast, wind, and the south location setting, off through travel into data formation setting and grounds. So put yourself in positions of balance in all that position location measure. So the infrastructure is the properties itself, process lines and windows, and a 4-line rotations at 3 centers of scale. There's the building. So you want to go into the different levels and set position with its location system all through travel. Okay, that process how you go through your pie of clocking. Okay, now that indicates system that your 3 centers lines of scale over measure. See, structure within a structure within a structure. Right, now you process that, and then you come into high lines of screens and high lines of programming, a process in your system how you see yourself on different angles of the structure of the building, which is really amazing through pi. So you understand more levels of your advertising, your agencies, and that position location, your building, infrastructure, you're processing your system, how you use your consumers, and that communication setting, and putting yourself in a byproduct of set design. You want to be your own end user. You want to be your own investor in that process of communication, which you gauge in viewers and set lines of travel. So that process indicates in system all the calculations. Now in that directions, this is where you go next in lines of calculations. You outline your signals in that process of communications. You come into high volume, more and modification grounds, into pi generations of screens, adaptations of flux. Okay, you build higher lines of structures and direction. All right, so we process that indicate lines of ground, so it's set position, location, measure, and scale. It's calculate and modify. Set position echo, set location of sonar and travel communication. All right. Now that indicates all lines and circuit line screen adaptation and travel. So you have the direct line link in that communications and configuring system of Skynet. Skynet lines the signals, locates the system all through travel. Directing line state location setting. Indicates line screen adaptation and travel, process lines into pyramid activations and rotation lines of surface that process indications. All right. Road graphing screens, 3 centers of travel, 4 lines of measure, 5 lines of scale. So that's communication online sequence of processing and communication lines of high position of scale. So that's indication of high centers in location system of fortitude location of scale. So the operation line sequence, you have planetary alignments and rotation lines of grounds. Online center, online position of 3 triangulation line, can molecular structure line, divine line. High centers position, solar system is above the system, locations, everything's happening in and now, but the future adaptation has to process your system where you are in clocking it, communication. Setting the lines of travel, direct lines of link inside the structure of design line of its properties, and set travel. So if we get a true understanding of how this all works, it's much easier to modify the systems, how you come into that setting through structure of design line, into the position locations through its all calculate and modify direction. Okay, so I'm just trying to get you guys to understand these things, because now you're coming out of your positions and settings, coming into your track communications. Coming out of the line connection clocking, which are identified, now you have to understand how you come into your own crossing streams, your own bridgings, your own operation system, your own mind adaptation of itself, coming into new games, not the structure you already created through an algorithm. So that process lines everything through eternity, equals lines of everything through all levels, which is the nothing. Equals lines of setting through nothing lines, coming into the energy lines, screen lines existing already, and 3 lines of flux over a screen, adaptation line card centers, equal lines equation, 4 fluxing screen adaptations, all different directions, all set calculation lines of 4 lines of sequence location of panel. Process indicates lines of pyramid activation 1, process lines of pyramid activation 2, process lines of pyramid activation 3, and process lines of communication lines of pyramid activation 4, in real-time communication of scale. Inside line condition setting convergence system. Portals of communication lines, direct lines and link line communication convergence system, all through calculate modify line position all levels, and calculation rotation lines of setting. Indicate grounds, online sequence, online panel, process lines of flux over line, directing lines, communication lines of pi, high calculation screen locations into inhibitors or screen adaptation setting, all through its compass, all through its course, all through time, and set travel. So it's very powerful how you come in positions. Now, once you get in a direct line center and understand what you're structuring in that position locations, you understand what's going on in settings, all right? So you get out of your film strips and online sequence and position lines of processing. Your communication of ground centers on the part of acceleration over line centers in a half pipe and set travel. So that's calculation of full half pipe and line condition setting, 2/3, 3/3, 4/3 line setting lines of communication. Directing ground centers, signal lines, position of center, operation lines over cross line inside communication to its setting. Inside travel, directing line, positions, historical fields, operation lines of fields, process lines that indicates the setting of travel. Directing ground centers, online center, online position location, measure and scale. Indicates lines of clocking, foundation lines of grounds, and set lines of sequence. Set operation lines, platforms over a sequence. 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of measure, and 5 lines of scale. Is set communications. Live in the platforms and setting equals lines of course centers, directing line current indication of the clocking lines of position to its operation. Sets communication inside inline connection setting to its convergent system, all through travel communications. Okay, so it's understanding how to go through product acceleration of the parallels in travel. Okay. So if you really look at it, you can see it lines of course centers, which is nothing but a central cloud to an I cloud to an E cloud. So that's all communication and grounds and online sequence through platforms that indicates and sending through structured division location through settings. So what you have to truly understand, if you understand the platforms, there's 7 levels of travel: constellations, processing, directions, locations, and direction. Okay, indicates over lines, so position of 0 over 1, indicates lines of triangulation, signature lines, operation lines of sequence. Okay, high signal lines of grounds into 1 of A, process lines of B, process lines of C, set position lines of E, factors over D, D factors over question and travel. Okay, there's a triangulation, there's your pyramid, and rotation lines of grounds and set lines of sequence. So the more you go higher, the more you get in your embedding system of your computer operation of your platforms that travels to your structure of your building. Downshift lines of anomaly, force centers, and lines of screen adaptations, right? So you got to stay above the equal line in position to the equilibrium in the process of transitions over transactions that you do through transition of transference. It's that position, right? So if you don't, you go through the platforms. If you don't, you go through the platforms. If you don't, you go down and down and down and down, right? So that gets you in positions in that earth line center, a 3 spectrum of light, 3 sections of the location, setting division, and 3-dimensional lines of space. Platitudes in location, the 3 body frame, course centers, the 3 paradigm, and line screen adaptation, and polar shift. Process indicates lines back in position locations and settings. Low spectrum, live in the 3-dimensional scale, and 3 centers of measure, 3 centers on communication. 3-dimensional space. So you got to stay above the 144 platform, guys, because your body's constantly traveling through the seconds, minutes, and hours, the codification system. As long as you're clocking your systems and setting the 2025 center operating line connections into high position location, pyramid activation lines, and screen locations, you have no problem with the center operation of your system. But you have to understand the triangulation and understand the flux, what you're doing through all communication in the system that puts you in console and position navigating to the navigation you are in travel. Okay? So understanding the position of what you're doing in travel communication with clocking system, all through balance. Okay? So that's all it is. It's the infrastructure that you're basically putting yourself into, being embedded, staying above the 144 flux. Okay? So every time you're going down, you're in a low spectrum, living that cycles in real time, affecting you and affecting everybody else in their timeline and their timeline lineage. Now, if they get in their timeline lineage, they're locked in that line center location. So you're no longer in your clocking system. You're no longer in your foundation setting. You're in their timeline, living their timeline in real time that's affecting everything up timeline itself. So if we get a true understanding of this how it works, then you send the platforms that you have to stay in balance, win that position, bring yourself in that position back in 144, that sets you in design, that brings you in position, location, measure, and scale above the system. Beyond the system, I am the system, all through attractions. Okay? So that's how you have to modify things and everything through travel. So you get in a better understanding how to set up the structures in that line communication with its convergent system, all through calculations. So knowing exactly how to come into that depth line and that position locations, you guys are coming out of divisional cortex and line center locations. You're coming into more your imagination of your mind that's already set up in travel. So if we understand how to coordinate that and understand how to flux through that, we can bypass these things. We understand what we're doing through clocking, but we don't get positions on the levels. We don't cross the bridging. All right. We don't cross the bridging. We're just observing everything. Okay. So you do not cross the bridge. You don't cross the bridge. You don't go through pi. Okay, because now you're in the center operation of pi. Now you're in position of going through the platforms of pi, in position lines of travels and direct lines and where you are in that sending of communication. So you're in that planetary alignment, evolving in their system, going through their seconds, minutes, and hours in their time, no longer in your time, which is the process where you are in the center operation of 2025. That's the balance between the past, the present, and the future that keeps you in the presence of everything. Without that, There's no existence of anything time of clocking system. Now you're trapped. Now you're locked. And that positionalizes the setting. So it's about understanding where you are in your time frame, where you are in clocking, where you are in foundation of set positionalize the calculation. Okay? So that's going to help you identify yourselves, have to really come into your own set positions and your set calculations, because your inner childs, because we're now in eternity over lines across lines, we're passing lines, bypassing that line condition setting, equal lines of nothing, pass lines equal lines into all position lines of calculation, green lines adaptation setting into set travels something new. Okay, which is everything through a new lines of communications. The communication sent into the oversoul is over lines of signals, colonize its own system, coming in its new game now, coming in its new structure. Understand how to create a new puzzle, not the puzzle that's already created. Children get bored very fast, but they keep files of that indication sending with them every time they draw. They never throw their drawings out. They put them on their fridge to show their parents. So we have to process that and understand that. We keep that on file. And every time you keep something on file, it helps you decide what you're doing in that position, location, measure, and scale. You process yourself. You're always in the now of everything. All you're doing is expanding your system through space and time. So you can't take yourself out of the center because you're already in the operation of itself. That puts you in the position, location, how you see yourself, the clocking and that communication lines of convergence. So it's really understanding that in set position, its operations or locations. How to see yourself in motivation setting is knowing exactly what you're doing. Living the cycles in that real-time scale that puts you in position locations and that settings. All right. Then you get into platforms in set position here, travel that positions here, travel position here. So now you're in the center here, now you're center here, now you're center here, and set travel. You're docking your stations, XD1000 here, 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 platform of communication. Directing ground centers, it's an operation just expanding and exploring through all levels of a window frame and travel. Okay, but you're not crossing the bridge of travel. You're not ready until you understand how to cross the streams. So it's kind of like you're looking through a window frame like this. Okay, so this is you in set positions to get turn standard settings. Okay, so this is you. Okay, he's looking at a window. Okay, and here you are right here. There's your face. And your face, as it crosses over, it closes the portal, right? So when you close the portal, all this disappears. And now you're locked in their timeline, which time lineage their system. Now you're in their clocking system, no longer in your clocking center. Disappears. And everything around you disappears. So 2025. And it confuses where your body is now because it doesn't understand its conception of time. And that erases you in time in set positions. Erased. Back to the future. That's real, but Back to the Future isn't until you identify what Back to the Future is to you and set position line setting all through imagination of the mind. Now you're locked in that time frame. Now you're living the existence of its locations, which is its intelligence now. You're locked in their intelligence, you're in their time frame, you're no longer in your timeline because now you're erased in set position. Okay, so they come over and to see you, say, what's going on here? What are you doing here? And the settings. And you're like this. You're in a full body now, because now you're landing and they're setting out their time lineage, living their set position. Now in that position, you're going, I don't know, how do I get out of here? You understand? That's what you have to start identifying. Is your clockings, your foundations, and your times, and all frame communications, all at once, all right? So that just gives you a basic understanding why it's so important is to basically stay in the observation and just look at the open window. Okay, and you see everything inside. You see the planets, you see the intelligence. And you're right here observing everything, but you're not crossing over the stream in set tractions. That's you observing everything. Now, the more you observe, the more you understand positions on travel through pi. And once you understand pi, then you understand the center. Once you understand center, then you understand your past, present, and future. And once you get in that position, then you keep existing and evolving yourself, creating things of new in that positions, right? Then you keep evolving your platforms and then you can see yourself in that position. So it's basically understanding levels of nothing, but knowing everything of access of everything you already have, which is the process of everything locations. I'm not talking about what you created. I'm not talking about what you're creating. I'm talking about everything that equalizes core centers of communication coming into something new. You've already codified the 7 days a week. You're already codified line, position, location, how you see your months and years, and lines and seconds, minutes and hours and frame and clock and foundation of the system. Now you have to identify it on your own setting of your own path. Okay, not going through the path you already went through, which is unified through ascension. Now we have to understand how to use it through eternity over pi in that position, how we sit in lines of communications, how the inner child itself is creating new structures of design, which is everything new. New models, new prototypes, new motherships, new galaxies, new alignments, new universes, new solar systems. That's what we're coming into now. Now you guys have to identify that in frequencies, and all you do is stay in observations and set lines of travel. You're observing everything in that position, location, measure, and scale. That's all you're doing in travel. You're looking this way, and this way, in directions as you're talking to different lines of intelligence and information setting. But you're not crossing the streams and traveling into their set position of its operation of the time frame. Okay? That's what you have to identify. Right? Okay? And that's why I want you guys to truly stand. And the more you let go, the more you start to identify everything around you is always in the now. Imagine what that is when you get in classification of your systems and more understanding how to see yourself where you need to be. Understand you already have the key to its existing of you, right? But equals lines is the equation. Equals lines is all levels of eternity. Equals lines of nothing. Full access of clearance of everything, which is no memory. No memory, but having clear of everything. Process of you living out of the projections, how you see online centers, online sequence, online platforms of communication and projection. Starting to recognize that there's no film strip, it's set design. You're just living the cycles, not experiencing the cycles. You're not in muscle memory anymore because we're at a higher frequency now. So there's nothing to remember if you're living the cycles in real time. Clocking your system at 2026. Okay, that's a 2026 line setting line positional levels. Measure in the set calculation lines of flux. Center operation lines is 2025. That flux line is the screen. That has to be in the center. So that stays in tether, that stays in operation, right? So you have a clocking center and position lines appearing in activation of 3 centers of travel, directing grounds, powers, and atmospheres in your galaxy of alignment and screen locations. Directing ground center, online sequence, online panel, online position processing, Earth line in 2025. Sets communication of past, present, and future, and set position of presence of everything. That's how it has to be, okay? So now you see the structure and division of its location system and a lower spectrum of light of calculation. Your properties of the building, okay? So you understand the bandwidth, then you can change the formation setting the time frame into your clocking system, an infrastructure system of the calculation. Different structure of the building, right? And set in a triangulation. Different angle of the building and set positions. And you can go into this position and locations to a smaller structure of its building itself. Is that travel? Different structures of buildings all at once. So now you're going to different time frames in that position. So you see 2026, 2027, 2028 through structure of inventory that puts you in positions of an outline sequence that keeps you going, and forward line course centers that you're changing your properties every single time you go through seconds, minutes, hours to clocking up the foundations. It's a very powerful structure, all right? But you have to stay above the 144 all times, because that affects everything you do through triangulation in set position. But look at all the structure of the properties they can go through. So you're seeing different levels of structures, different levels of time, but on the same time all at once. Start in that position, you start with line settings, process lines of galaxy, 3 lines of signals, 3 lines of grounds, 3 lines of service set travels in position. Galaxy alignments, 1 center, travels in position, all levels, ground set, calculated, modified, directing lines, and data formation setting and track locations. Putting energy fields, force fields around your system and your ground lines of the Earth. Setting communication lines of high centers, location system, all through travel. Sets calculation ground centers, online sequence for location of Earth and travel communications. So you apply it to division location setting. So you're teleporting from one Earth to another Earth to another Earth to another Earth. You have 6 line provision lines in habitation zones. And you got 6 line provision location in habitation zones that you have to understand first. Now, once you understand that, then you can cross the streams. When you cross the streams, your position location is coming out of sync, out of mind, out of space, out of time. That puts lines of communication, solar system lines of calculation, green location setting all through travel. Says calculation lines and grounds, 25 line centers, 2025. Then you can get into flux, center operation line settings, process of 2 over operation, 2 centers of travel, 5 lines of measure and scale. Says course centers, a 2000 line, operation line sequence, 2000 line, and 5 line scale communications. Metric meters, scale lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 4, 6, 8, and 12 set position. Operation line calculation, ground centers, line center, line communication, convergent system, all through travel, all through calculations. Directed ground center, energetic dome, rotation setting to travel. directing ground center, online sequence location, and convergence location of travel. Particle line screen, torical fields, directing lines, and particle line acceleration lines of parallels, and direct line communication and convergence system all through travel. Directing online sequence on lines of platforms. Now, once you get in that position, you create higher lines of communication lines of platforms into higher communication lines of space. Platforms in position, 2040, 2060, online sequence, platitude location setting, your CCTV. That's what happens when you go beyond. But you have this center of you first and now. Understand where you are, understand where you're going to be next, right? So where you're going to be next, you have to understand how to formulate that through a 3-clocking system, which is the grounds, which is the powers, and the atmospheres and travel, your GPA. The process your indication setting when you come in the body conceptual system all through travel has a direct line link that your process and that communication is convergence system all through travel, right? So you're grounding your system, setting lines of position, location, placements, correlation calculation lines to its atmospheres and lines of travel. 3 centers of communication lines, energetic line, process line, indicates line, communication setting, convergence system 144. Once your 144 adds platforms, it travels indirect lines to another line communication out of the convergence system and settings. Now you're in 3000 air. Okay, in real time. Have an ongoing conversation through the tangle, but you're in the same time frame. Okay, so it's ways of looking at it in all ways in formation system, all through calculations, right? And that's where you get in position lines. When you get in that settings, you can set up jump scars to planetary alignment and set lines of communications. What your body through is set lines of alignment, location setting all through travel. And that puts its location setting. So jump scar in here, 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 and set travel. So you can go back there anytime through a docking station into your launch pads, location setting, and measure and scale. Sets communication. It's offset position. It's operation, right? Apply division lines, online cycle, online position, online travel, on that position, location, measure, and that location setting and flux. Process indication lines of grounds. 3 centers, 4 travels, set lines, 4 centers sequence, 4 lines of panel communications. Online center, earth line 1, platforms over set lines of sequence lines of 12. Process indication lines of calculation screen location system all through travel communications. Right? So again, another structure building, but a different level, different frequency. So you always have to have a building, which is your properties, guys. So what you're doing is basically you're modifying your tones, you're putting your position, location, and provision. And what you're getting, trying to understand these things is also configuration system, how your earth has to come with different structures or properties. So it can understand the platitudes of where it is. As you're seeing 2026 of a structure, you're seeing 2027, you're seeing 2028. In real time, that changes every information system out the calculations, but you're modifying your time frame and where you are in your clock and in your foundations. So you don't get confused where your body always is in the conceptual setting, where it always has to be in 144. Okay, or 244, or 344, or 444. Don't allow your body to be in position, location, setting to a timeline because it changes the time range of you in space. The time erases every location setting where you are in travel, which is all levels in your relation and how you see yourself in information systems. All through structure, all through division, all through design, all through calculations. Okay, different structures of design line, all right? So everything I'm saying is very more confusing for your system because now we're in eternity of everything, which is basically getting you guys out of vision cortex and you start to live in the cycles and know exactly what that is. It's plotted into your visions and locations. It's changing your formulas. It's changing your equations. It's putting a new structure, a new design line. So you want to come into your new thoughts, action, emotions, not what you already created in supposition and settings. Now, if we understand how we have to keep evolving ourselves, then you understand that we can't stop. There's nothing to stop and measure and scale. You just have to identify how you did this already through your mind of imagination systems. But the more you adapt to that, the more you understand the course through its recourse and how to understand how to use that and all communicates to its system all through travel, right? That's how it's done through its equations. Okay, that's going to help you and modify your system or where you are in communication setting. And that setting is all through travel, all right? See you in 5.